All right. In this tutorial, we will talk about flow control statements. Specifically, we'll talk about conditionals and loops, both of which are tools that are essential to any program, all right? And you can actually find them in any program due to the fact that they can increase the efficiency of the program a lot, in addition to the fact that they can add certain logics to these programs that can be added in any other way. All right. So to understand conditionals and loops or flow control statements in general, let's take this example. Let's assume that we had a simple program that consists of 4 statements, right? 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, the natural way of execution for this program will be sequential or linear, meaning that the first statement here will be executed first, then the second, then the third, then the fourth. Now, let's assume these 2 scenarios. What if we wanted to execute the second statement if and only if a certain condition or a criteria was met, right? That's one of the questions. The other question is, what if we wanted to execute these 2 statements, 3 and 4, a certain number of times, say 50 times, for example. Now, for that, we need certain tools to help us achieve these goals, right? And for that, we use conditionals and loops. So let's start with conditionals, and we will focus on one type of conditionals, which is the if and if else statements, although there are some other types of conditionals that I'll leave them to you to explore on your own. But for our purposes in this course, we will focus on the if and if else statements. Now, let's take this scenario. Let's assume that a customer, all right, visited some retailer website, okay, and he went on and did some shopping, added some items to the cart, and then checked out, okay. Now, the program installed on the website of this retailer, all right, will go through a series of conditions and actions in order to complete this transaction for the customer, right? Now, in this diagram, these rhombuses, these blue rhombuses, will represent conditions, whereas the gray rectangles here will represent the actions or the tasks carried out by the program. All right. So the moment the customer checks out, the program will first check if the customer is a member for this company or retailer. If he was not, then this path will be followed, right? And the action that will be taken or the task that will be executed by the program is to simply decline the purchase and then maybe display a failed transaction message or receipt for the customer, right? Now, what if the customer was actually a member? Then this path will be followed by the program, all right? And at that point, we come across, or the program, in other words, come across another condition to check if the customer asked for the items to be delivered to his house, right? And it's something that was selected by the customer during the shopping process, okay? Now, if the customer, or now we have another condition, right? If the customer didn't ask for the items to be delivered, then this path will be followed. And at that point, these tasks here will be executed. All right. Now, these tasks include first calculating the sales tax and then calculating the total, all right, the total of the items plus the sales tax, and then to execute the transaction by taking that amount from the customer account and deposit it maybe into the retailer account, right? And then fourth, a receipt will be displayed for the customer. On the other hand, if the customer actually asked for the items to be delivered, then this path here will be followed, right? And different set of tasks or actions will be taken or executed by the program, starting with obtaining the address that the system may have already stored, right, in the retailer's database, right? And then second, the sales tax will be calculated, right? Third, the delivery fee will be calculated, and then the total will be calculated as a fourth step, and then the transaction will be executed the same way it was executed when the customer didn't ask for delivery, right? And then a receipt will be displayed for the customer. So you see, different paths were followed or different actions were executed depending on whether certain criteria were met or not. Okay. Now, let us here take a look at a programmatic implementation of the diagram we just saw in the previous part. Okay, and the language, as you can see here, is Python, because as we discussed before, we will be using Python throughout this course. So the first statement, and remember this is a statement because we use a keyword from the language, which is the if statement, if keyword, sorry. So we start with a condition. If, then we open parentheses, and then we place a condition, which is basically an expression that will be eventually evaluated to either true or false. Remember, expressions must be evaluated to one single value, right? And when we talk about conditions for if statements, then they must be evaluated to either true or false, not any other value. It can't be integer, it can't be string, it can't be float value. It must be evaluated to a Boolean value, that is either true or false. Now, assuming that a member is simply a variable that holds a Boolean value, either true or false, depending on whether the customer is a member or not. Okay. Now, if the customer or the value of the member variable was actually true, then this will be true, right? And then the comparison will happen. So is true equal to true, right? If the answer is yes, and the customer is actually a member, then Python will move on to execute the body of this if statement right here. And we indicate that these statements here constitute the body of the if statement by leaving some white space or by indenting these statements. So you see, these statements here are actually indented than the original if statement here. So in the body of this if statement, all right, we will start executing them, right? So the first statement is yet another condition. Okay, now what is the condition inside? It is delivered is equal to true. Now let's assume delivered is just another variable or a flag that holds whether the customer asked for the items to be delivered or not. So it will the value of delivered will be either true or false. Okay, now assuming delivered was true, right, then true will be compared using the comparison operator to true, and the answer is true, right? True is actually equal to true. Therefore, we will move on to the body of the second if statement, which are these statements here. Why? Because they are indented after the original if statement or the parent if statement. Okay, so make sure to know what indentation is used for. It's used for indicating the body of the if statement here, right? So if the items were asked to be delivered, then we will execute these statements. We will obtain the address, calculate sales tax, calculate delivery fee, total, execute transaction, and then display the receipt. Okay, now let's assume that the customer didn't ask for the items to be delivered, and therefore delivered was set to false. Okay, in that case, false will be compared to true. So false is false equal to true? The answer is false. Therefore, Python will move on to the else part here. Okay, so which statements belong to the else part? These statements right here. Why? Because they are indented further away from the original else statement. So all of this is just white space, all right, or tabs. All right. So what statements do we have here? We calculate sales tax. Uh, we calculate the delivery fee, total, transaction, and receipt. Now, there is a mistake here, as you can see, which we can rectify right now, right? Which is that we don't need to calculate the delivery fee. Why? Because the customer didn't ask for the item to be delivered. So we only calculate the tax, total, transaction, and then we display the receipt. Okay? Now, that is one scenario. Now, what if the customer wasn't actually a member, and therefore this value of member here were false? So now we are comparing false to true. Is false equal to true? The answer is false. Therefore, we will move all the way to the else part. What do we have in the else part here? This statement. Why? Because it's indented further away from the else statement. Right? White space is here. So what actions or tasks do we execute in this case? We simply decline the purchase. So again, this is a programmatic way of executing conditionals. And as you can see, the program managed to follow different paths depending on different conditions. And I'm pretty sure that you are going to find a need for such statements in the future programs you are going to create. Okay? So that was it for conditionals. In the next part, we will be talking about loops, which is the second type of flow control statements.